Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Going back to questions people ask me about the voice referendum, one of the most common questions is, well, what is the executive government? What is a representation? And can the Parliament legislate to make this some sort of more orderly process rather than having representations flying everywhere to a whole lot of different people in the executive government? Okay, let's work through those. All right, so the first question is, well, what's the executive government? Well, it's basically what you call the government. And that means ministers. So they're the ones that are politically in charge. They run government departments. They have a portfolio which covers a whole lot of different bodies. They might be statutory bodies as well as government departments. And it also includes the public servants who exercise a role as well in the executive. It may include also some bodies that are created that are intended to be a bit more independent from government, but there's some argument about that. There may well be the case that some bodies that are intended to be independent from government, they may not necessarily fall within executive government description. But if the voice was concerned about matters dealt with by those organisations, it could still make representations to the relevant minister whose portfolio those bodies fell within, because ministers can generally direct policy and, if necessary, can get Parliament to change legislation that deals with those independent bodies. So all up, at the top of the tree, ministers, they're the ones you can make the representations to, and beneath them there are various public servants as well. Now, next question is, well, what's a representation then? Well, a representation is simply some kind of formal statement of a view that you're making, sometimes called a submission, for example, as well. It might also be described as advice. And it states or asks something from someone. So it might be a complaint about how a particular law is operating, it might be a request for a change in that law, but it's some kind of view formally given that is made on behalf of a person that is represented or a particular group that's being represented. So that's the word representation. Now, people say, well, hang on a minute, everyone's been telling me this is an advisory body, so why don't you use the word advice? Well, actually, earlier versions of this proposed amendment did use the word advice, and then someone pointed out, but hang on a minute, when you're a minister and you're giving advice to the Governor-General, that by convention can be considered to be a binding kind of advice, so something that you're required to do. And they thought, well, we don't want that kind of implication being drawn in relation to this amendment. There's no intention here that Parliament or the government be bound to do what the voice said, so thought maybe best not to use that word advice in case it got interpreted in a similar way in the future. What about the words consultation? Again, decided not to use the word consultation because that's a two-sided thing. It means that the government or the Parliament has to be involved in consulting the voice, and so it's a reciprocal thing. The word representation was used because it didn't involve any obligation on the other side as to how you respond to that representation, and it didn't have any connotation of obligation involved in it. So that's why the word was used. Now, the next question then is whether that means that the voice in making its representations can be whispering in the ear of bureaucrats at all levels throughout the government. Now, if that was the case, people can rightly assume that it could end up being pretty chaotic. You'd end up in a situation where, the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing and people weren't sure what was actually going on. So here, what comes into play is legislation. So section 129.3 says Parliament can legislate about the procedures and the powers, etc. of the voice. And part of that legislation would be regulating how those representations are made. So if you were Parliament and you were wanting to regulate it, what might you do? Well, the first thing you might do is you'd be concerned about transparency, right? You wouldn't want all this stuff to be done in secret, or you wouldn't want representations to be made that contradicted each other and caused confusion. You want transparency. So you might say, for example, right, all representations have to be done formally in writing, because we don't want this done by, whispers when people get confused and don't know what was said. and it has to be given to a particular place, like a register or a portal, where it can be published so that people can have access to it and know what representations are being made. Okay, that would seem fair enough. That's the sort of thing legislation might do. And then the second thing the legislation might do is say, okay, we also want you to, when you make those representations to the executive government, you need to make the representation to the responsible minister for the particular portfolio that the issue falls within. Now, why would you do that? Well, again, orderliness and efficiency, but also for what's called a whole of government reason. Quite a while ago now, I used to work in the Cabinet Office of New South Wales, and whole of government was a really important thing, because if you make you ask for a change, for example, in relation to one area, it can have an impact on a whole lot of other different areas. There's a sort of a flow-on effect, okay? And so the role of the Cabinet Office was a whole of government one, and that was whenever any submissions were made to Cabinet, to make sure that, you know, the minister making the submission, their department area will know about it and what its potential impact is. But we want to make sure that any other areas that it has an impact upon know about the proposal, and then can put information into Cabinet as well to make sure that all information is known about how any change would have an impact, so that you end up with sensible government policy. Now, it would be similar in relation to the voice. You would want to make sure, if you were Parliament, when you were legislating to regulate this, that the voice, in making its representations, puts them into some sort of place where you can then have whole of government consideration of them. So you wouldn't want the voice to be directly making representations to someone a fair way down the bureaucratic chain if it then wasn't known how that might impact on all the other areas of government. It makes much more sense for the representations to hit at the ministerial level, where you can work out all that whole of government stuff and then filter down appropriately once that's been considered. So that kind of legislation is the sort of thing that Parliament would enact. The next question you might ask is, well, does Parliament really have the power to do that? Because the power of the voice to make those representations is enshrined in the Constitution in section 129(2). You can't take that away. That's true. Parliament couldn't legislate to take away the ability of the voice to make representations to the executive government in its totality, right? But it could legislate to regulate how that is done, and to do it for sensible reasons like transparency, ensuring whole of government consideration, efficiency, all those sorts of things. So Parliament could, under section 129(3), regulate the way the voice makes its representations. So this sort of chaotic idea that people are suggesting is unlikely to occur if some kind of chaotic situation with the voice making all sorts of different unknown representations all over the place to different people was happening. Then the obvious answer is that Parliament would do the sensible thing, and that is to legislate, to regulate it, to make sure that it was a transparent, sensible and efficient system. So I hope that answered your question there about representations, executive government, and how they can be managed in a sensible way. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.